All right, good morning. You know, the Lord said in Matthew 25 that he would divide the sheep from the goats. Y'all can decide whether you sheep or goats. Turn your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, read for verse 16. Suzanne informed me that y'all are sheep over here, so that means Jay and those sit over there are goats. Oh, glad that you're here. Hope that you had a good week. We had a good singing Friday night. Good time. Had 54 here. Good number, and so had a good singing. But we're glad that you're here this morning to study God's Word. Do make sure that you get an announcement sheet. Jay's got us up to date on the announcements. Miss Nancy Heyman passed away this morning, and so we want to remember her son in our prayers as well. And there are others that are sick. Miss Dot Crabtree, her funeral was Friday. She had a graveside service out at Harpeth Hills. And events that are coming up, Trick or Trunk is Saturday the 29th. There's not going to be a meal with that. It's because we're eating the next day. We're having a meal on the 5th, the 5th Sunday, not the 5th, but on the 5th Sunday, the last Sunday of October. We'll treat it as a fellowship Sunday. And so that's the day we'll eat. So they decided not to eat at Trick or Trunk. So remember that. And be mindful of those. Is there anything else we need to announce? All right. Well, we were ready for Ecclesiastes 3. Oh, Solomon, going through life, trying to figure life out. It's interesting, his take on life. It's interesting how when you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it does change. And it's almost as if Solomon is just writing in the end of his life, he's writing sort of how he went through life, his philosophy, and really how it changed. And when you think about that and you see that, you say, okay, I get it. Because when we get down to especially verse 19 here in just a few minutes, my feeling is, and maybe I'm incorrect, but my feeling is that maybe Solomon had not given much thought about his soul or even the existence of his soul. And we'll talk about that when we get there here in just a few minutes. But Solomon is going to, especially in the 4th chapter, when we turn the page here, as we get to it in a few minutes, Solomon's going to talk about how that he really went through some experiments with regards to looking at life through different eyes. And we'll address that in a minute. But Solomon is seeking happiness, meaning in life. What's the meaning? What's the purpose in life? And it's so sad to say that at least the majority of this book, which may have been the majority of his life, he can't find happiness or meaning in anything. Now, he will eventually, and he thankfully does find meaning and purpose in God. But as we know, we go back to the book of 1 Kings, we read of Solomon, we read of his life, how he lived his life. He was not, he was wise, but he wasn't too smart, you might say, in some of the decisions that he made. But here's his search, and we continue as he talks about how that injustice seems to just prevail over everything. Beginning with me in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 16, he says, "Moreover, I saw under the sun." Now, there's our phrase. We need to remember that. This is what I saw happening in life. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. In other words, here's a question. If you go back and remember what we studied last week, the first part of the 3rd chapter, where's God? Where's God in all of this? And how can God be in control if nothing seems to be right? What should be good is not, and what should be right is not, and what's wicked, it's good. It seems like it's doing all right. Just there is not a fairness in life. You ever felt that way? You ever felt like life is not fair? Why am I, as a Christian, suffering more, seemingly, than the individual that's not a Christian? Why do I have less as a Christian than the individual that's not a Christian seems to have more? Why? Well, I think in many ways that's the problem that Solomon is facing. And he said, I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there's a time there for every purpose and for every work. Well, that's how he began the third chapter, right? Time to weep, time to mourn, time to laugh, all these different times. He says there's a time for everything. But he comes to a great understanding, doesn't he? Everybody will get theirs. God will judge. And that's where we take comfort. And it's not so much that, oh, well, God's going to get those wicked people. And when God gets them, they'll wish that they had been righteous. But it's just the fact that it all equals out. The justice of God does prevail, does equal out. And then he says, I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them that they may see that they themselves are like animals. Well, analyze that for a minute. He said, here's what I said to myself concerning the condition. The word condition means cause or reason. He says, the reason the sons of men, he says, God tests them. Excuse me. The word test here is interesting. You've heard of winnowing, the idea of sort of separating the chaff from the wheat. That's really the background of this word. God, he says, God tests them. God proves them to see what they are. But then he says that they may see that they themselves are like animals. What's the difference between a human and, say, the old cow out in the middle of the pasture? Well, I can move on now because that's the right answer. Yeah, very true. Very true. What else? Man can reason. Yeah. Animal can't. Can be trained. What else? What does a man have that an animal does not have? Soul. Man has a soul, an animal doesn't. And so Solomon here seems to reason as if, well, man's just like the animal. And so we wonder, and I don't know, I don't know that you can nail this down, but you say, well, was Solomon sort of a materialist? In other words, this is it. There's nothing beyond. Well, no, because you go to the 11th and 12th chapters, and you would say the contrary. Because remember, he even says in the 12th chapter that the body returns to the dust of the earth and soul to God that gave it. Could it be that at least at this point in his going through life, that he either A, does not understand that he has a soul, or B, could he have just forgotten about it from the standpoint of in his reasoning and in his deduction, he did not put that in? I don't know the answer. But I know that his statement that man, or that he came to the conclusion, at least at this point in time, that man's just like the animals is not true. But he goes on to say, notice what he goes on to say. He says, for what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. And here's how his conclusion rolls. He says, one thing befalls them, as one dies, so dies the other. In other words, here's how men and animals are alike. Well, they die. Well, yeah, they do. And he says, surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over the animals, for all is vanity. In other words, they die. They breathe, but then they die. Well, that's true. our animals, whether they are domesticated pets or just animals out in the wild, that our animals have breath and then they pass, and so do we. And so maybe he's looking at this from a, like I say, more of a philosophical, materialist standpoint of just saying, here's how we're alike. He's not putting us in the same category. Maybe that's the answer to this. I don't know, but it just seems at this time that Solomon may be estranged from God and just is not taking into account his soul and the eternity in which that which he has will take place. But he goes on, he says, all go to one place, all are from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal which goes downward to the earth? Now he's all of a sudden he seems to change a little bit. He gets to that statement of that he was going to make in the 12th chapter. And so he says, well, here's the difference. And the difference ultimately is God, isn't it? And man's ability, because he has the reasoning ability, because he has the ability to pick and choose, because he has the mentality, is different than the animal himself. And so he says, verse 22, so I perceived, or I saw, that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? He sort of seems to be lost. Solomon seems to be lost in the sight of the future and his existence in the future. And he seems to be more of the here and now. And so he's basically saying, as he concludes this chapter, and I'm by no means saying that he's right, nor would he even say that he's right as he's writing this. But he said, I came to the conclusion that really the only thing we could leave and the only thing that would carry forth is what we could make and what we could leave. And so what we can make and what we can leave. You ever thought about when you die what you're going to leave behind? Those that will be over your estate, your children, your grandchildren, whoever it may be, what they'll go through, what you'll leave behind. Folks, have wills made. Folks have directions a lot of times that they leave their family members. And, I think we should all give thought to that. I really do. I think we should think about it. I'm sort of like the man one time that I shared this out in the parking lot not long ago with some folks. I read about a man one time that he had just got back from a very expensive vacation. And it was a couple of days later, and he went, and this was the day in which everybody had the road atlas and the maps in the house, and he went and he was getting down the road atlas, and his wife said, "What in the world are you doing?" He said, "I'm planning my next vacation." She said, "Well, we can't afford another vacation." He said, "Oh yeah." Well, he said, "Before long we're going to go, and I'm going to have one just as big as this last one." And she said, "We can't afford it." He said, "I want my children to cry when I die. And so I'm not leaving them anything." Well, I don't know that we want to be like that, but we should give thought to all of that. And Solomon, it just seems as if he's just what you can make with your hands, leave that, and that's it. Anything else? There's a lot more that could be said, but is there anything else? Yeah, yeah, yeah. In 1 Kings 11, you talk about his wives and his concubines, and it says that his wives turned away his heart from God. Verse 4. So yeah, I think that was probably the biggest portion of it. Anything else, Jim? until they get later in life, and then always said, I thought Copper would be written all the way. It said, train up the child in the way he should go. Right. When he's old, he'll not depart. Right. I think it should say, train up the child, and when it won't depart from him. It'll stick in his mind. Yeah. And come back. I think that's what happens to Solomon. I think you have a good point. Yeah, it does. It does. Well, I think what happens with regards to that cycle that you just mentioned, this is my own personal take, is that when we're younger, we have, as the old saying goes, we have too many fish to fry. And we don't have it all. We're trying to figure it all out. And when we get later in life, we all of a sudden realize the fish are fried and they're fixing to be eaten. And we want to make sure that that we're on the right side, and we should. And it's sad that we've spent our life in toil, missing so many other opportunities to make a good impact on others for good and right. So very true. So yeah, Solomon, yes, I wanted to say more with regards to that in the church, but I didn't want any bitterness to come out or people perceive that I was bitter. That is probably one of the biggest, as a young preacher, was probably one of the biggest disappointments. You know, you come out of school and you're idealistic. You know, you've got all this training that you've had, and you get the degree, and the teachers have filled you full. And to be honest, because even somebody like me that, quote, grew up in the church, father was an elder in the church, dad did not bring church problems home. Matter of fact, most folks got mad at my mother because they would ask her, well, what's going on? And she would say, I don't know. And she says, when they make an announcement, that's when we'll both know. And that's right. Dad never brought it home. I knew more after I left home. After I got into the ministry, I knew a lot about what was going on because I became Dad's confidant. But at the same time, too, Dad never brought it home to Mother and to us as kids. But when you're young and idealistic, you think, man, the church is great. And then you get into it and you realize, yeah, there's a lot of issues. Back a few years ago, I had a man come in. He was an elder in the church, not this congregation. He came in and sat down in my office, and he said, man, I wouldn't have your job for nothing. And I laughed, and I said, well, I'm glad because I want to keep it. But I asked him, I said, well, why? He said, there's too much politics involved in all this. And I said, no, there's no politics. It's just the Word of God. And people draw their own conclusions and have their own difficulties with it, but we'll stand true on the Word. And so I see it a little differently maybe than he saw it. But I do see, and I do understand, we portray one thing and sometimes we are another. But let me say this about the church. While people that don't want to go to church and don't want to be a part of the Lord's church will point to us and say, well, there's nothing down there but a bunch of hypocrites. The truth is, we present ourselves one way and we are another. But we try to explain that we are who we are. Now, let me explain that. We would be the first, I believe every one of us would be the first to tell anybody that we're sinners, that we are individuals that absolutely do not do every time what we're supposed to do. But we are saved by the grace of God sinners that are struggling to do what is right, to do what the Lord would have us to do. And sometimes we do fail because we do make the wrong decisions, because we do listen to temptation, which shows the humanness of which we are. But knowing that we need God and we need to rely upon Him and trust Him and let Him help us get through it and let Him do as He has promised He will do, save us in the end. And so while we present ourselves as being individuals that are following God, we know that we fall short. And sad aspect is we would be the first and are the first to say that. But the world does not hear that part of our message. They only hear the part that says, man, don't you want to come to church and be a part of the Lord's church? And don't you want to be saved? And then they say, you good two shoes. They don't hear that last part of that sentence or the last part of that paragraph that says, you know, we're just like you, but we're saved by the grace of God. And so I'm with you. I think verse 17 where he talks about how that, you know, he saw things he didn't want to see, but were reality. Yeah, you see it in the church. Anything else? Yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, yeah, you could find examples probably of both. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Very true. Very true. Anything else? Well, let me give you 2 or 3 points. I like to look back at a chapter and think, okay, what can I learn from this chapter? I think one thing that you can really pick up on is to accept life, to enjoy it one day at a time, to be satisfied, never satisfied with self, but satisfied with life. It's called contentment. Contentment. Paul said, I have learned in whatever state I am therewith to be content. Philippians chapter 4. And I like that verse because here's the one thing that it really teaches me. Paul said, I learned. The word learned there means to come to know through a process. In other words, through time, Paul had learned to be content. And as we all know, when he wrote Philippians, he was in prison. He was probably chained to a Roman guard every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Paul evidently had gone for a period of time, if you go back and read the book of Philippians, without. The church of Philippi had not been able to give him what they had promised him. They had not been able to send him support. But Paul says, I've learned to be happy. And that's one thing seemingly maybe Solomon had trouble with in the first part of this chapter. He couldn't accept life. He couldn't enjoy it. He wasn't satisfied. Another lesson that I learned is that life doesn't always seem to be fair. And sometimes it's not. But you get back to what he said, and that is verse 17, God shall judge. God shall judge. And I'm thankful that God's the judge, but I do know that I can be a fruit inspector. Anything else, or a lesson maybe that you saw in the 3rd chapter? All right, well, let's move over to the 4th chapter. Life's not fair. Our son, Ethan, when he was a kid, and probably even so now, but our son had a very strict line of what was fair and what was not fair. And every once in a while, I'd have to have a conversation with him about, you're right. Life's not fair. Life is not equal, but that's all right. God's going to get you through. And so with that thought and with that vision, if you will, Solomon then moves forward. And as we begin in the 4th chapter, and it's going to take us a few chapters to get through this, but Solomon is going to watch some people, And he's going to watch them go through various experiences in life. He's going to talk about seemingly, the first chapter. The first verse of the fourth chapter. He's going to talk about a courtroom, and then he's going to talk about a marketplace, and then he's going to talk about men. He's going to go through some life experiences. And his conclusion is that anything, above all things, life is not monotonous. Life it really has twists and turns. And we may not have an idea of what problem's coming next, but a problem is coming and may come in life. There are key words, and the key word beginning in this chapter is observation. Observe. Here are some observations that Solomon makes as he looks through various aspects of life. He says, I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed. But they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praised the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. This is a man that is struggling. He sees all these injustices. He says, look what he says. He says, I see the oppressed. He said, I see the tears of the oppressed. And they're exploited, and they have no one to take care of them. They have no one to comfort them. And he says, on the side of their oppressors, there's power. They don't have any comfort. The power hungry are becoming bigger and greater, and the small innocent man is becoming smaller and more innocent, if you will. Sort of like Paul, when I was studying this the other day, I thought, this sort of reminds me of what Paul said, that no one stood with him in 2 Timothy chapter 4. My first answer, all men forsook me. And it just seems as if Solomon said, the oppressed are oppressed, and the oppressor there's power. But then he says, therefore I praise the dead. He says, look, there's no fairness in life. There's only sorrow, there's only grief, there's only disappointment. And he says, so I praised the dead. Death seemed to be his motivating force. And death, if you look in verses 2 and 3, death seems to be his motivating force to enjoying life and to pushing him through in life. I've heard some people say before, as they've gotten sick, after they got well, they said, man, I was so sick that I thought the only option was to die, and that would have been better. Have you ever been to that point? I hope you haven't, but have you ever been to that point? Well, Solomon, he almost sees that. He says, I praise the dead. They're already dead. They've gone through this. They've gone through all the problems of life, and they're on the other side. But he says, even better, verse 3, is the guy that never existed. Kind of a sad commentary on life, if you will, as he looks at life as being so empty and so useless that he can't find any joy or any peace or any satisfaction. Anything else? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I never figured that part out. I still haven't really, but yeah, that was the accusation. Yeah. I'm sure to gain all the wealth that he had, not only was through gifts, but through taxation. And so, yeah, must have made it hard on them. And so it would from that observation, which is very correct, and from this observation, you see a man that is soured on life and probably hard on others. A sour person usually is hard on everybody else, right? You ever been around a sour person? Suzanne wakes up to one every morning. She looks and she says, "Oh, you're still here." Sour in disposition. And Solomon just seems to be, I can't help but read this and think about how much of his life, I wondered, how much of his life was really this messed up. That he was just sour. Just life was useless, vanity. It was all useless, nothing good. So he goes on and he looks at the marketplace. So he looked at what some call the courtroom. He said, I just looked at folks and saw the oppressed, the sad getting sadder, if you will. And so he looks in the marketplace. He says, again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful man, a man is envied by his neighbor. Excessive work versus enough work is kind of the discussion in these verses. He says, this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. The industrious man versus the lazy man. How much work do you work? How much work is needful? What is considered work? Look what he says. He said, I saw the toil in every skillful work of man. He's envied by his neighbor. Well, yeah. You know, you've got talents that I don't have, and I'd like to have some of those. I probably don't have anything you would like, but I do. I hadn't thought about this till the other day. Well, Friday I was reading something. I believe it was Brother Cecil May wrote something. I've gotten out really. I remember the sentiment. I don't remember who wrote it, but anyway, he made the statement. He says, what preachers have that a lot of people don't have is that preachers have, for the most part, overcome the fear of stage fright, of getting in front of people and talking. I hadn't thought about it that way. I know our son does not like to be a public figure. Our son, when he was in high school, set as a goal for himself to be third in his class. You know why third? He didn't want to give the valedictorian or the salutatorian address. Guess what he was in his class? Third. He was what he wanted to be because he didn't want to give that speech at graduation. He's still not comfortable getting up and teaching a class. Now he'll lead singing, which I wouldn't dare do, but he'll do that. Well, you got to have that talent, brother, you know. And like I said, I hadn't got it. Steve came up to me Friday night. That was one of the reasons I was laughing when Jay said I was laughing. Is Steve came up to me Friday night and he said, "Your name's not on here." I said, "You want to clear this building out quick? We can do it." But here, you know, Solomon seems to be asking the question almost, at least to me, how much work is work? And it is funny. Some of the things that maybe I go to excess. I have a little bit of OCD. Although, if you go look up in psychology books, OCD, what we call OCD and what is true OCD is really different. It really is. But I have what the common man calls OCD. The psychologists would not call it OCD. They just call it weird. No, but I have the, and so, you know, I was thinking as we were on vacation with Ethan and the Gotts, but I got into Ethan's car and I thought, I know that my OCD did not rub off on you because my car would not be this dirty. But he, you know, that's just not one of his priorities to keep a clean car. And so he does other things quite well, but keeping a clean car is not one of them. So you know, you have to ask to what is excess. But here's his point. He's basically saying, you know, I looked and I saw folks and I saw work, and he says, really, what good is it? He talks about the idle man, the lazy man, the fool. Fool is the idea of an idle man, the lazy man, the man that doesn't do anything. He folds his hands, he doesn't do anything, and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind, chasing the wind. He says, better is a handful, and the New King James uses the word quietness. The word quietness there, the Hebrew word, means peace or serenity. It has that idea. Can also, have the idea of security. And so he says that there really needs to be a balance. There needs to be a balance in life. And you got those folks that are motivated by pleasure, and that only heads to ruin. Or you can have those that are so eat up with, I got to work more, got to work more, got to work more, got to work more, got to work more. And that creates problems. I know of a man, I tried to explain this to him on several occasions, and I was not successful in explaining it to him. His take of life and what he enjoyed and what his wife's take on life and what she enjoyed were two different things. He was convinced that she was wrong. She didn't listen to him. Now, here was the take. She liked to be up. She liked to be about. There was always, something else to do in the house, or there was something to cook. If not for them, for somebody else, maybe for the kids or the grandkids, or for a sick person or a shut-in. His take is that if he was hunting or fishing, he was doing what he wanted to do. But then when he came home, all he wanted to do was sit in his chair, read his National Geographic, and watch his wildlife shows. And he wanted her to sit right beside him. He felt accomplished out in the wild, if you will, and evidently he was a pretty good sportsman. She felt at home, cooking and cleaning. He would grow upset, very upset, at the fact that sometimes she just wouldn't come and sit down. He wanted her to come and sit down and rest. And I tried to explain to him that was not her take on life. And be happy with her, live with her in happiness. And they have, because they've been married for over 50 years probably. But let her be her and you be you. Well, Solomon seems to have a little bit of a problem with this. And so he's raising a question, he's raising a point. But then he says, verse 7, then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor daughter. Son nor brother. I'm sorry, I can't read this one. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all of his labors, nor in his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asked, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. Here's a man that seemingly, verse 8, he has no family, no friends, no nothing. His labor, according to Solomon, appears to be vain. And he asks the question, well, why is he toiling? Only for personal gain. But then you have to ask yourself, from a less pragmatic standpoint, you have to ask yourself, yes, but if he's not hurting anybody and he enjoys that, let him go. And Solomon, it seemingly is saying that he doesn't understand. Because to him, it was pointless, it was meaningless. And he couldn't understand. Maybe Solomon needed to require something that was a cause that was bigger than himself. And he needed to understand the work and the meaning of work. Yes. No, go ahead. I'm fine. Yeah, he flips. He does. Very true. Anything else? That was all he did. Yeah, that's why I view Ecclesiastes as not just a one-time, this is my philosophy of life. This was my I'm writing about this as I went through it. And so this is a kind of a I see it and and I hope I'm not wrong because I don't want to mislead anybody, but I see Ecclesiastes as a man writing about his life and everything and his journey. And admittedly, life's journey. Jim, I think, brought that up so well, as he always does. Just a second ago, life's a journey, and um, I'll share this. I hope Ethan doesn't listen to this, but he probably won't. But Ethan, without doubt, loves his dad. I've never doubted that a bit. He just never wanted to be like his dad. And that's fine because he has to be himself. He's a faithful child of God, and I'm thankful for that and raising his daughter to go to church and do the right things. And his wife's a great Christian, and I'm thankful for that as well. But Kara has, within this year, confided within me. She said, he's getting more like you, and I remind him of that often. I said, don't. It'll create trouble. But we do, don't we? But we have a process. We have a journey of life. And just think. Go back to when you got out of high school. Your philosophy of life, your philosophy of how you're going to live your life, how to raise children, and then when you had children, it changed. I didn't preach. I did not. I preached on the family, but I never and purposefully never preached on how to raise children until I had one. And well, actually, what it was, Steve. Yeah, I thank you. Bless you. But part of that too was I got some advice from or just a statement from an older preacher that said once. He said, I knew how to raise children until I had one. And so I took that and I ran with that in my early preaching years. And so I talked about the family, but I didn't talk about how to raise children. And then I had one, and then I'm convinced that I also heard one preacher say one time, I'd already had kid Ethan at the time, but he said I preached a lot on how to raise children, and then I had one. And he said I went back and tore all those sermons up. So that there's a lot of truth in that too. But that's how I see Solomon. His journey is progressing, and I'm thankful that he comes to the end. And he says, Ecclesiastes 12:1, remember now you created in the days of your youth. And really he does grasp it in the end. Anything else? It's all good. Well, he talks about friendships. Ooh. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion, but woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and threefold cord is not quickly broken. I'm going to start this, but there's a whole lot in here to dissect, and I won't cover it all anyway. But think about how that two really are better than one. Every once in a while, I get an idea, and I don't present it to the elders first. I usually ask my sweet wife, what do you think? Do you think this would work? Do you think this is a good idea? And she is very supportive. But she sometimes said, yeah, and it probably wasn't a good idea. But sometimes she says no, and sometimes I can tell by the way she's talking about it. It's just leave it alone. Two are better than one. If a man is left to his own thinking, he's a very small package, right? It's good to bounce ideas off one another. That's why, I'm not a big fan of meetings And the older I get, the less I like them. I understand they are reality. And that's why I like it. I do like elders meetings, elders and deacons meetings, because sometimes you go into a room and you think, well, we'll do this, or you have this idea. And then all of a sudden you see everybody else's point of view. Right, Steve? Jay? You see everybody else's point of view and you go, and I've gone in elders meetings, not much here, but in other places with thoughts about maybe doing something this way. And we do it because the elders say, yeah, that's good. But it's very much different in the back end than it was in the front end because of their thoughts, because of deacons' thoughts. And so two are better than one. And they have a good reward for their labor. Because, yeah, if one falls, the other's able to pick him up. Back in the 1980s, and it progressed, there was a movement in our own brotherhood called the Crossroads Movement that later became known as the Boston Movement, which ultimately later became known as Independent Churches of Christ, which is now basically called Metropolitan Church. Well, no, Metropolitan Church is something else, but it's sort of caved in on itself. There's one thing in it that they forced as doctrine, which the Bible doesn't teach, but I do think that it is a good idea as long as you don't push it as being something God required. And that is that as Christians, we should have somebody, not so much that we're accountable to, but we should have a good Christian friend or neighbor that we can sit and talk about our struggles, our temptations, our trials. Now, we have to be very careful with that. I know that. And I'm not saying, well, you got to do this and anything like that. And I know that you got to be careful the friends that you pick. Have any of you ever studied Scientology? The religion of the movie stars? One of the things that they base is they get you to come out and tell them basically everything about them. About yourself. And as you tell everything about yourself, then they use that as blackmail to keep you in their group. Now that's an oversimplification. I can tell you how they do it. Yeah, I had to. Why did I study it? Because somebody asked me to. I was talking about different faiths, and somebody said, "Would you please present a couple of lessons on Scientology?" So it's a lot of work, and so that's an oversimplification. So if you get with, say, accountability partners, you can have that issue. But if you have somebody, and I know of a guy here in Nashville that's part of, he has told us 3 groups that like they may eat breakfast, like the first Thursday of the month, or they might go out to lunch every so often, and they deal with what's going on in their lives and spiritually. I see that as a good thing. Occasionally, at least once a month, I try to go to at least one preacher meeting, if not 2, are held in this area. But it helps me. It helps me. We in the group that Jerry has, the third Monday workshop. When I was going through some stuff here a few years ago, one of my good buddies asked me. He says, "Why don't you bring this up in group?" I said, "I learn more by listening to other people's problems than I do by mine. Besides, I don't want them to know I'm that stupid." And he said, "Well, I agree with you." But he heard a lot of it, and he helped me through a lot of it. But 2 are better than 1. And Solomon is going to deal with that. Anything else we need to stop, or I need to shut up? Is there anything we need to say? Well, I want to pick up with verses 10 and 11 because I want us to talk about a threefold cord. I heard a lesson several years ago on this. I've even preached on the threefold cord. I think it's an interesting aspect. And so we'll deal with that, and we'll go on into the 5th chapter. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, for loving us and taking care of us. And we're thankful that you are with us on our journey through life as Solomon was going through his journey. Help us, though, not to have the pessimistic, not to have the outlook that all is vanity, but help us to have the outlook of love and hope and optimism. Help us to be individuals that look for the sunshine and not the rain, that look for the good and not the bad, that look for the hope and not the failure. We ask that you watch over us, that you bless us and keep us. Hold us within your hand, for this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.